Good afternoon. Renee Wyckoff, Research Design Engineer at L&E Research. We're so glad you could join us today for the third webinar in a series of webinars hosted by L&E in 2018. Our webinar series focuses on the 6 steps to perfect qual, and today's webinar will focus specifically on steps 4 and 5, qualitative analysis and insight communication. Our webinar series ties in with our white paper series as well, so we'll be sending out a copy of the white paper in addition to the recording of this webinar should you be interested in revisiting or sharing it with your colleagues that couldn't attend. Before we get started, I'd like to mention that we'll be taking questions and answering them at the end of the discussion. So let's get things kicked off and start with meeting our 3 guest speakers. Let's start with Sean Stripling.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sean Stripling. Thanks for the invitation in the introduction, Renee. I've spent about 22 plus years on the agency side of marketing, primarily in the strategic planning and insights team. Most recently, I led MullenLowe as Chief Strategy Officer, and I was the global director of an inside consultancy called Frank About Women, and I oversaw 6 countries of female-focused marketing efforts. And in truth be told, I've never met an insight that I didn't like.
Thanks, John. And let's go to Walt Barron.
Hello, my name is Walt. I am currently the Chief Strategy Officer at McKinney. I was a journalist in a former life and switched over to advertising about 19 years ago. I went to the VCU Brand Center and have worked in agencies ever since, coming up through the planning track. And now I do a lot more than just that, but still am a planner at my core. And just to show you how small this industry is, my very first informational interview as a student at VCU was with Sean when she was working at McKinney. So it's good to see things kind of come full circle. And I'm glad to be part of this today. Thank you.
Thank you, Walt. And last but not least, we have Joan Lewis.
Hi, thanks, Renee. This is Joan. I spent my first career at Procter & Gamble doing a lot of different parts of market research work for lots of different businesses, from upstream innovation to brand work and advertising and media and partnerships with retailers. And since the beginning of 2015, I've been doing boards of directors work for a variety of for-profit companies, including 3 companies in the research, insights, and analytics industry. So all told, I've been in the industry about 30 years, which is hard to believe. And I appreciate your inviting me to join you today.
Thank you, Joan. It's truly our pleasure. And we're going to actually stay with you, Joan, because we're going to get right into this. I'd like to start with you and sharing some of your stories. I know in your role when you were with P&G and now in your current board roles, you've seen a lot of data presented to you. Tell us what presentations really stood out to you, what really sticks, and what kind of approaches are most compelling to you?
Well, I would argue, unfortunately, that presentation skills and styles and storytelling have not evolved sufficiently in market research in the last 30 years, even though I think we all recognize that we need to focus on that end of the work. It's not necessarily our skill set. So we still see a lot of research or insights that are presented in PowerPoint or are presented in long reports. It's nice when they include verbatims, but sometimes that's as creative as it gets. And it's very hard when I've spent my career on mostly on what you would call the client side, although I was often in the role of providing research and insights to internal business partners as well. It's always a struggle to break through that. The ones that really do break through are the ones that, in its simplest sense, tend to be multimedia and tend to be heartfelt. So when you have someone who's speaking with conviction from their own observations of consumers and their own interpretation and beliefs, and when they can bring it to life, videos are common and they still work better than PowerPoints, but when they can bring it to life in other ways, like we had situations at P&G where a business team constructed a teen girl's bedroom and walked people through many times over, many different groups to continue to show them how to bring this to life and what it really looks like. And people really remember those things, but more importantly, they're influenced by them more than they are even by a great report.
Thank you, Joan. Sean and Walt, similarly, I know you've made lots of presentations. What was it about those experiences? What elements made it exceptional? The preparation, the tools, your relationship with the client? Let's start with you, Sean.
Well, certainly all of those things, but when I've really had a client or even a potential client sort of hanging on every word, it's typically been a combination of data-driven insights, but shaped into something deeply relatable. I loved Joan's, example of the teen girl's room. When you can put yourself in that element, it just makes it feel so much more personal. I've learned something, I mean, as we all have, given our various research, but each time you listen to the consumer or shop with the consumer or buy or cook or even do laundry with the consumer, you learn something very, very real. And I think that's truly when the magic of storytelling takes flight, when you can couple sort of that consumer truth or insight with a profound meaning at the intersection of not just the insight, but also some data to support it. And then sort of as a third point, when you're able to then shape that within sort of the culture and what's happening today, truly you have something special. And I'll just give you a very brief example of working with my client Ulta Beauty, the retailer. They gave us an assignment for their annual Mother's Day event, which was simply a radio record for a gift with purchase. And they wanted it to be very clearly just give mom the gift of beauty. And we thought, well, that's pretty straightforward, but why doesn't mom feel beautiful? Or has she ever felt beautiful? Or does she think of herself as beautiful? And the client simply said, well, no one's ever asked. And so, it was a real opportunity to say, let's push further, let's ask smarter questions, let's ask different questions. And as you might imagine, most of us said, yes, we believe our mom is the most beautiful person that we know. But then we asked a different question. When was the last time you told her she was beautiful? And it was shocking that 90% of consumers don't ever recall saying to their mom, I think you're beautiful. So, when unfolded from that type of insight probing was a platform to allow adult children and small children too, but to tell their mother she's beautiful. And we were able to develop a campaign not only of the sharing of that very simple articulation of her beauty, but we sold a lot of product as well. So, my entire point is to in some ways tug on the heartstrings when you can, but identify the insight, couple it with some powerful data, and you've got a real 1-2 punch.
Thank you, Sean. Walt, what can you add to that?
Yeah, building on both what Joan and Sean said, I think that a big reason clients want to work with agencies, it goes beyond just their capabilities. I think a lot of it is about the perspective that we bring, the perspective of someone outside of their company or organization, but also that we can bring perspective from other clients. And we try to apply a methodology, I guess you could say, that's taken from the world of navigation, and that's triangulation. And we apply that to the research that we do. So the basic premise, you probably are familiar with this, but the idea is that you're much more likely to reach your destination and get an accurate read on where you're going if you have multiple other reference points to help guide you. And so we apply that to research, and we try to look at the problem and our audience who we're trying to connect with from three perspectives. One is their perspective, probably most obvious, and that comes from talking to them, from hearing what they say and looking at what they do in the world, their behavior, their actions as well. The other is to get the perspective of someone who knows them very well. It could be a friend or family member. It could be a coworker. It could be somebody who serves them coffee every day. And then the last one, which we always try to bring this to any assignment we do, is our own perspective. So we always try to put ourselves in the shoes, metaphorically speaking, of the people we're trying to connect with, and experience what they experience in their lives and how that relates to the category. One quick example of this, when we were pitching Clear Choice Dental last year, they are a company that does very high-end premium dental implant transformations. And this is an audience that is not easy to find because people don't really want to talk about their severe dental health issues. But we, in addition to pouring through the client's research and looking at data that we gleaned online and in social and other places, we also tried to put ourselves in the perspective of somebody who needed one of these dental transformations. So we sent people down to their center outside of Charlotte to see what the consultation process was like. And then by chance, I happened to be getting a single dental implant at the time, which doesn't really reach the same level as their patients. But I was able to bring some of that personal experience of knowing what having bad teeth essentially does to your social life, how you tend to withdraw from things that you otherwise wouldn't because you're embarrassed. And that became a really key insight that drove a lot of the work. So apologies for that rambling answer, but I hope that makes sense.
It does make sense, and I think it's really important that you put yourself in the consumer's shoes and are able to see it from their perspective. So now that we've discussed some of the things that work for you, I'm sure there are some horror stories or some things that you know have not worked when presenting or sharing information, be it a personal experience or one that you've witnessed that left you cringing. Not naming names, but any of those that you can share with our audience so they could learn what not to do as opposed to the things to do. Let's start with you, Sean.
Yeah, I'd love to. I've seen it happen so many times and probably been guilty in the past, but don't just plow forward with your content without giving a moment to consider the room dynamics. You know, and it's harder to do when you're starting out early in your career and you're just really eager to share every single thing that you've learned. But I have taken the time to kind of survey the room, understand who's in the room, and making sure that we have the right amount of content or the most salient points. And with all of that observation, I think as a team, you need to be prepared to pivot on the fly. If you realize that the CEO in the room has a very limited time and has asked his assistant to come and get him in 20 minutes, you really need to think about what are the critical points you need to make while you have that person. So, and that is a skill set that needs to be sort of developed over time. My team and I would frequently not only just generate a pre-meeting list of questions that we might receive during the presentation, but we almost created role-playing models where we would troubleshoot almost sort of bizarre scenarios or worst-case scenarios so that we really could be prepared for anything. But I think, you know, we were talking, or Joan was mentioning earlier, that the presentation format hasn't evolved much in 30 years, and I think we're all guilty of relying on standardized formats such as PowerPoint. So I think that, you know, any good presenter, someone who really wants to get across their point, is going to be able to create a multi-dimensional conversation.
Thank you. Joan, being on the receiving end of a presentation, is there anything that you can share?
I think being in various roles and senior positions at Procter & Gamble means we've seen every possible kind of presentation, often very good, but often not. And there's three things I would say that might be useful for people to take away. One is, again, the stack of PowerPoints is a terrible idea. I once spoke at SMR in Amsterdam, and I brought a printed out report from one of the very largest research suppliers in the world, and held it up for the audience of like 1,000 and said, I will never read this. Don't ever bring this to me again. So that's one thing. Secondly, as I have coached people over many years, both inside and outside Procter & Gamble and in other ways in board positions, it seems like the most consistent coaching I've ever given people that seems to be incredibly obvious yet make a huge difference is put your materials together however you're going to give them, look at the end and put it at the beginning. So research people tend to like our process and our learning, and we want to help bring people to our conclusions, and we want them to come to our conclusions for the right reasons. We want them to learn along with us. And there's many admirable things about that instinct. But what it means is we often want to take people on a journey and bring them to an end big reveal. And by that time, the CEO is either out of the room or on their phone. Like it is such an instinct, a relentless instinct for research people, and a terrible audience engagement strategy. take what you put at the end, put it at the beginning, and then people might come on the journey with you willingly because then they're intrigued. But don't take people through your process. And the last thing that I want to share, especially for people who are bringing your company into a client, is if I personally, and I've told companies this over the years, don't show me 10 slides on your company background before getting to the work that we have commissioned or the pitch you want to make or the insights and conclusions that you've drawn. I never want to see another world's map slide with dots on it for how many offices a company has. It is the fastest way to lose an audience who is there to listen to you. And by putting the sales pitch up front, no one cares. And by that time, it's seen as an opportunity for a company to come in and talk about themselves instead of my business. So I would strongly urge you, again, there might be a couple of valuable slides on that, but don't start with them.
That's really good to know. I think that's really important information for those listening. Walt, what can you share with us on that?
Yeah, I just want to add to what Joan said, and I think, Joan, the tendency you described is not specific to research people. I think that's true of a lot of us. Is that we want to tell this wonderful story and kind of build up and lead them down this path to this magical reveal, and I think we all have that tendency, but I will reference something that I heard, some advice I got early on in developing strategies, which is enroll your creative teams at every step of the way. Make them believe and understand that they're part of it. And I think the exact same thing applies to clients. And that's one example where it got us into trouble is we had this great idea of how to enroll them in what we were sharing, both the research and strategy that we were sharing, but we hadn't properly enrolled everyone. And something we thought was going to be a magical moment turned out to work for the half that we had enrolled and really backfired on the half we hadn't. So I know it's a simple thing, but don't be too protective of it and share it. Be really generous with your research, your approaches, what you're learning, the insights you're gathering as you go. It'll make the presentation and the storytelling even more effective.
Thank you, Walt. So we put some great examples of the communication insights and what to do and what not to do. Now we're going to go back and just kind of focus in on a few things. So let's talk about useful tools and bringing data to life, and also pushing past some common obstacles. So on the topic of useful tools to assist in your process, do you have any go-to technology tools that might make it easier for you to tell your story? Tools that help get the data in alignment so you can effectively extract your insights. Let's start with you on that, Sean.
Yes, I love to assign pre-work, and whether that's for a big client meeting, and that goes for both client side and internal team as well, or if it's going into qualitative research, it can be a great way to jump past some of those necessary items you have to cover off when you're looking for consumer information and insights. So in assigning pre-work, it helps if it can be highly organized and make it simple for all. So at my last agency, we actually built a journaling app to capture sort of in-aisle observations or in-home use behaviors during qualitative discussions. But what we found was it was equally useful as a tool leading up to large creative client presentations. So we might build out something for the client to explore, some cultural ideation or environmental work for them to do before they come into the meeting. So in many ways, I loved Walt's term enrollment, but in many ways it was enrolling the clients in part of that build up to the meeting so that they had some of the same inputs coming into the conversation rather than just waiting for it to unfold as a formalized presentation. So pre-journaling can also help eliminate some of the housekeeping content that you need to just get out of the way to get to the meat of the material.
Got it. And Walt, can you follow on that?
Yeah, I think tech can be a blessing and a curse. Obviously, it provides amazing new opportunities for us to learn, and we take advantage of some of those. Our technology department here has created a really helpful tool that allows us to scrape reviews wherever those exist, on Amazon, Yelp, anywhere. And we can pour through thousands of reviews and analyze that fairly quickly to get to some rich insights. You know, we use social media listening tools as well. Anytime there's a specific bespoke approach that has to do with technology, we'll explore that as well. But I think the bigger thing with looking at new tools is to make sure that it fits the assignment, and more so is appropriate for the audience you're trying to learn from. So there may be a new technology or language that you use. You know, the language of different generations, whether that's visual language, whether that's things like emojis and memes, or whether it's actual words that you're using, is to make sure that it's appropriate for who you're talking to. You know, something that we've found has been very effective when we're doing interviews is to do video interviews with people in the comfort of their own home or their work environment, or wherever they are most comfortable. We feel like that allows them to open up and give us more candid answers. But the truth is, some people are not comfortable in that environment, and you have to make sure that you're able to kind of meet them where they are, because it's not really helpful if it's not making them comfortable, and if they're not able to open up and give you honest answers.
Thanks, Walt. That's really good information. And Joan, I know that this is not really a topic that would be on your end, but did you have anything to add to that? Joan, are you there?
Yes, I am here, but I was on mute. Out of respect for Sean and Walt, who are the real experts in this area. The only thing I would add is that from a client side, it is a huge help when a company does try to engage people directly and with technology that helps move your client along too. So I would encourage the kinds of examples that you shared. Those are helpful for those of us who've spent our lives on the client side, where we're trying to evolve business partners' engagement forward as well.
Thanks, Joan. So moving right along. As we know, when delivering insights to your client, it's all about storytelling. It's about turning the data we collected and analyzed into your story so that our clients can turn that information into actionable insights. What does your process or template look like for turning data you've collected into a story and bringing it to life? Well, let's start with you. What does your process look like?
Well, it starts with us pouring through anything that exists already. Obviously, our clients know their businesses inside and out. So we want to take advantage of what they've already learned and then build on that. I think, you know, the example that I gave up front about triangulation applies here. That, you know, when clients come to agencies, one of the biggest benefits they have is the perspective that we will bring that is fresh. You know, I think oftentimes in trying to fully understand the client's business, we sometimes maybe undervalue how important it is that we do have an outside perspective. And so going through the process of what a customer experiences, their journey, ourselves, like I said, putting ourselves in their shoes is really valuable before we come to conclusions and we make up our mind about the way things are. It's the one chance at the beginning of a relationship that you have to truly bring a fresh perspective before you kind of get your mindset. So I think that is a key cornerstone of what we try to do at the outset of any project.
Got it. And Sean, what does your process look like?
Very similar, and I think that, you know, that certainly that overall exploration of soaking up all the knowns and then looking for the unknowns is pretty, it works pretty well. And this may be a total cheat, but many times when I'm trying to get to, you know, building out the right research outline or even building out the right research protocol, I will write my hypothesis first, and will even go so far as to title some of the slides in the dreaded PowerPoint, but just so that I have a flow that I'm working against. And either way, I may be right or wrong, but I look for the data to prove out for that. And in many cases, I'll write some hypotheses that are really outlandish or completely fantastic, simply to sort of pressure test what I think I know about the culture and the category at the time. And you know, it can shake out a lot of different leaves from the tree when you do that, because if you go in with those preconceived ideas or you're looking for sort of confirmation of what you already know, frankly, you're going to get it. So, you know, for me, it's all about working from an outline that both has some real surprises built into it, but also gives me a narrative that I can work from no matter what the data tells me. And I think it's important to ask, you know, within that construct, you know, you must ask some of the obvious questions. And I know that there are going to be a lot of cases where we have to, you know, confirm or validate some of the incoming components that the clients are going to give us. But I think asking the questions that no one has thought of before, or even questions that don't always seem as relevant, are where you're going to get some of the more interesting data points. And I just will reference again the Ulta example of, yeah, 95% of humans think their mom is beautiful, but that was a fairly obvious question. The real spark came when we asked the question, when was the last time you told her? So that's just an example of trying to push beyond sort of the obvious.
Thank you. And Joan, from your perspective, is there anything that you've seen that you can share with us?
The only thing I would add to the really good perspective from Sean and Walt is to intentionally go back through, especially in qualitative research, and have a conversation about what disproved your hypotheses. What did you hear that made you, that forced you to rethink? And typically, you know, I think starting hypothesis-led is really important, but it also leads us to listen for confirmation of those hypotheses and to have reasons why the things we heard that contradicted didn't count as much, and to force yourself to go through that conversation, often directly with the client, to say, well, here's what we heard that was opposed to this, and here's how we believe that relates, instead of focusing only on the things that illustrate what you were looking for.
I see, thank you. Now, going back a little bit and shifting direction, Sean, one of the common problems when working with clients is confirmation bias. They come to the table with an answer already in mind. How do you reduce that effect with your client to push beyond the obvious questions and to get to the meaningful insights and get them to be open to something that could reframe their market?
And this is so directly related to what we were just talking about. It's perfect.
Right. Exactly.
Exactly. And so, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes that pre-work that you do with clients, or consumers for that matter, can be a great way of getting some of those biases out in the open and really give us a chance to examine them as a group and decide, you know, are these biases coming in something that is so institutionally true we can't possibly walk away from it, or is there an opportunity to really debunk some of those myths, or at least challenge the assumptions of where the myths came from and if they're still relevant in today's world. There'll always be a legitimate need for such things like packaging claims and copy test taglines and things of that nature that will help us mitigate some risk. But along with those must-haves, we always try and ask the teams or our clients, you know, a wild card question or two, and also just ask permission right up front if within the construct of research, qualitative or otherwise, can we probe on sacred cows? And again, if you do this pre-work up front, you know what those are coming in, and you also know the risk associated with probing on those. You'll get it pretty quickly from your client if there's that, you know, immediate allergic reaction. But you can even push on that a little bit and say, you know, help me with the whys versus just the stated sacred cow. So one example I'll give you was a pitch example very recently of our team pitching an indoor skydiving company, and they built their entire company based on a very small but passionate team of skydivers in the US that wanted to be able to to replicate and practice their skydiving in a more controlled setting. So they built out these wind tunnels, great, but that serviced a very small base. So this company was interested in attracting more of a tourism business or more of an experience-based, broader consumer. And what we found was the very language that they used, they talked in terms of jumps and of skydives and of minutes, and we're talking about an experience that's around $60 to $70 a minute, so that's certainly a premium. But what we found, the very language they used was actually incongruent with what this different type of vacationer or consumer wanted. No one actually wanted to skydive. They wanted something much more safe, reliable, less risk, and so they were confirming a fear-based belief that consumers had around this product, when in fact, once you got inside the tunnel, it was very much like flying. So having that conversation with the client about reframing the language of their experience was very difficult, because not only were they tied to it because they came from that passion-based community, but it was printed on outside of all of their buildings and part of their signage. So these are the types of really tough conversations that you're going to have with yourselves and your clients over time. And if it comes down to literally creating a business model approach to say you're alienating this percentage of potential users by the simple language on the building, that's a compelling conversation to have. So circling back to confirmation bias, that client came in with some institutional knowledge they believed to be true based on experience, but we had to kind of open their eyes to why that may not be as relevant with today's consumer.
Thanks. So I'm just curious, did they change all of that after these insights and after the research?
They are in process. They are in process. Mm-hmm. And they actually developed an organization around the term body flight, and it was a competitive organization that may end up being part of the Olympics one day. They're going through the process of trying to have it legitimized in that fashion. So I think once they get to the point of having exposure around the term body flight, they will be able to make the leap to change the signage. But it would, there's operational challenges involved, so we recognize that too.
Sure. And Walt, what can you add to that?
Yeah, I'm just going to draw upon a kind of a basic truth, but I think it's very applicable to kind of managing the desire for confirmation bias, or on the flip side, to refute a new idea. I think that it starts with seeing clients as partners and seeing them as being on the team. And if they're part of the team, then that changes the way that you relate to them. And a strategist here likes to talk about how he forms relationships with the client's research team the same way he thinks about forming relationships with creatives. That trust is built when the more you interact, the more you get to know them. That's obviously on a professional level, and it could be even on a social level too. But what that does is it creates a comfort level with asking questions that may seem uncomfortable, like, does so-and-so, is so-and-so at the organization just looking to confirm this, or are we actually going on a true exploration with this research? Because I think what we find a lot of the times is that our clients aren't always on the exact same page on every issue, that there are people who see things differently, and that they're also looking to explore as well as we are, and not just confirm a hunch or a belief that somebody has. So the more that you can develop those relationships, they become partners in the process, and they're pretty smart about not only the techniques and the methods to go out and employ, but what will work to open minds at the organization. What do they need? Are they more numbers driven? Are they more story driven? Are they more qualitative driven? Or is it something else? How do you craft the argument? And then you become partners in that process of trying to, I don't want to say fight confirmation bias, but just be aware of it and manage it appropriately.
Thanks. I think that the word partner and referring to yourself as partners is really important, as it makes, it might make your client feel that that you are a team and that you're on their side. And I think that that's really important in creating that bond.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's oftentimes, and I understand it, there's this belief that the client's research team is out to kill the idea that the agency has, and it's just not true. I think that there's always multiple perspectives, and it's a matter of getting in there and really understanding where the true concerns are coming from and what can be done to try to resolve them.
Thank you very much. And Joan, what about from your side?
Well, I couldn't reinforce enough Walt's point about partnering with people in the company's insights organization or whoever really is helping to bring the work into the company, because very often they're the ones who really want the company to be more insight driven, and most of the time, I'm sure there are some exceptions, but most of the time they are not trying to kill the work. They're really just trying to leverage it to its greatest effect, and when they can be part of that process, they'll be a better partner for you. But more generally speaking, I think the best way that I have ever found to overcome confirmation bias and the belief that we know everything about our business is to take your audience through an experience themselves. Get them to go through a change in their own thoughts and beliefs in your presentation, your session, your engagement dialogue with them, which is very difficult, but actually doable. And one of the things that I did at Procter & Gamble for quite a few years is, when I was the officer for consumer market knowledge, is conduct training for experienced vice presidents in the company. And the more experienced your target audience is, the more they're convinced they know everything about their business, because they do. You know, they've often been in that business for years. They've talked to consumers. Especially at a company like P&G that values direct consumer contact, you know, they've been on shop-alongs, et cetera. So it can be even harder to bring them new insights. But the training that I was doing for these folks a couple of times a year was really to teach them that they don't know everything and that they need to be open to empathy. And of course they say, we already do that. So there were two things in this process that were in the session that invariably created a giant shift in their beliefs from where they came in the door that same morning. One was some pre-work that I had them do, which was a very short, simple survey about experiences in their lives. And it asked them questions about how they spent their free time, whether anyone in their household had to punch a time clock, whether they or anyone in their household ever lost salary if they were needed to call in sick, how they viewed different publications, different news sources, et cetera. A very high level and easy to click through and answer kind of set of questions. But we asked those same questions of a real population in the US, and opened the session by having a comparison between their answers and the answers of other people. So these are experienced VPs. We asked them things like, how much do you spend on groceries? And they would say, I don't know. Do you collect coupons? No, I don't bother. Things like that. And then we would show them the experience of the reported answers of a regular population of the US. And of course, regular people know exactly how much they have to spend on groceries. They do collect coupons. Their entertainment is not the country club, and it's not flying to the Caribbean for spring break. It is driving places, et cetera. So that would be the first step in opening their minds. And I expected this not to have very much impact because it's just a survey, but it provoked extensive conversation. Like, I used to punch a time clock when I was young, so therefore I understand consumers, and we would have a very challenging conversation about that. But the second step of it was we actually sent them out into stores. We did send them on shop-alongs, but many people have done those, and those are always good, and the consumers are always the stars, and sometimes you get great insights out of it. But instead, we sent them to stores with partners and a budget and a profile of the kind of person that they were going to be role-playing. And doing it in partnership was important because we said you have to hold each other accountable to really do this in a good spirit and not just phone it in. And they did. And we would give them a profile to say, you are a single mom, you have $60 to spend this week on groceries, and your baby is sick and you need to buy medication within that $60. But here's your grocery list and go make it work. And they would go out and we would give them an envelope of cash. And they would go out and they would really buy the products, and they would come back and lay them out and talk about them. And we had people with tears in their eyes come back and explain how they had to prioritize things that did not include Procter & Gamble products because they couldn't afford them. We had people come back and say, I had to put things back at the checkout because I couldn't pay for them, and I was so ashamed. And it was the most interesting way I've ever seen people genuinely change their views and go back motivated to meet Procter & Gamble's goal, which is to improve lives a little bit every day, and to go back motivated to do that and to overcome their belief. These are people with 25 years with the company very often, and they may have been in laundry detergent all that time. And to have them say, I had no idea, is your best evidence of having broken through some of that confirmation bias.
That is a really interesting example. Talk about putting yourself in the consumer's shoes. You brought in that human element. Yeah, literally putting you in the consumer's shoes. That's really interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Joan, we're going to stay with you for one of the last questions. So shifting a little bit again, from your perspective, Joan, what happens to a qualitative report once it's released into the wild, so to speak? What kind of report content and format follow that through the organization?
Well, we've talked about a lot of things today that make your content more accessible, more engaging, and of course, all of those things increase the odds that your content travels after you release it into the wild, so to speak. And very often, the kind of emotional catharsis that you're trying to bring people through is very hard to extend beyond the team who directly participated with you in the work. And unfortunately, when the reporting is a PowerPoint or a single presentation, it ends up in a drawer, and that team may be convinced, but they have a hard time carrying it through to the rest of the company to take action. So the things that work the best and the things that I'd recommend people consider are, first of all, to consider your presentation back to the client, the start of the journey instead of the end. So Walt said earlier, having a partner inside the company, start working with that person or that small group of people before the research is even done to create a plan to carry it through beyond a report, beyond a presentation, and accompany those people to bring it to their stakeholders to the greatest degree that you can, and build that into the plan, the timeline, and the cost up front, because no one wants the research to lie in someone's drawer and have no impact, least of all the people who paid for it. So expand their thinking and challenge them to what is the journey that we're beginning once we finish the research. The second thing that I would do is prepare materials that live without you, but allow your business partners to carry things into more meetings than you can ever show up in. Little leave-behinds, little brochures, little videos, little things that get people engaged and can travel on their own. Even a laminated fold-out card that brings some of those points to life with visuals can go very far toward extending the life of the research by allowing your business partners to take it to more places.
Thank you so much, Joan. Really appreciate that. So we've had a lot of valuable information. Thank you so much. In closing, is there any one thing that we might not have touched on before we move on to questions? I'll take that as no. So again, I want to thank you all so much, Sean, Walt, and Joan, for sharing your insights and experiences with us. This was really good information today. We're going to take some questions for the next few minutes. But first, we'd like to thank Focus Forward, our transcription partner, who so graciously volunteered to transcribe this webinar for free. Focus Forward is just one of our technology partners that we've partnered with to bring a complete qualitative toolkit to our clients. We will be emailing out the recording of this webinar, and you can view this webinar or download a copy of this free transcript at our website, as well as learn about all of our exciting technologies offered through L&E's solutions at www.leresearch.com. All right, so let's get started with some questions, and bear with me one moment. I have a skinny little pane that I can see, so I'm just gonna make sure that I'm getting through all of these. Okay, we have one, and we're gonna start with a listener is asking, they're not sure what you mean by pre-journaling, and I think this goes back to something that you were discussing, Sean, about tools that you use as far as pre-journaling.
Yes, and it literally, we built an app, but you don't have to have the app. You can make just a short assignment. It can be written or otherwise, but pre-journaling was something that we used both with clients and or recruits when we were embarking on qualitative, that gave them a list of questions or assignments that they should complete before the meeting or before the focus group. And sometimes those assignments, if they were client assignments, could be more cultural in nature versus product or even category. So it helped expand sort of the platform in which they might receive our information. But it literally was meant to be a tool that just sort of pushed the thinking beyond the obvious. And in many cases, we would even send out journal kits to qualitative respondents around the country and then have them collect data and information and send it back to us. It really can be designed to be anything you need it to be. I think if I were giving some pointers on how to make sure you see fulfillment and completion is, 10 questions or less is probably best. And the more simple the instructions, also the better. And then anytime you can incorporate, like I said, we built an app to do this in a digital sense, but anytime that you can incorporate, photo or video currency, you're going to get richer material. So that's really what I was referencing. I hope that helps.
Thanks, Sean. And this next one is not a question, but it's a comment. Joan, someone commented that you gave a brilliant example of giving executives a real world perspective. So thanks for that, Joan.
Thank you. It's definitely something that I've tried to repeat in other settings too. It was a great lesson that worked way better than I expected it to, frankly.
No, that was a really good story. I liked that one. All right, so the next one, someone asks, I often wonder how storytelling as a means of communication works. If you tell the end right up front, doesn't this rather undermine the principles of storytelling and keeping the tension there? Who'd like to touch on that one? Anyone?
So this is Joan. I was the person who said, please put your conclusions up front, so I will address that. If you're genuinely telling a story in the sense of the hero's journey, the arc of a story, then yes, the person answering the question is exactly right. You want to take people on that journey. But I think market researchers often tell ourselves we're telling a story when what we're really doing is sharing an insight. And those are very different things. If you can construct a story with an actual human hero who is like a real consumer, and you can tell their story, or better yet, have them tell their story somehow, that's wonderful. But very often we call storytelling isn't. And I would just be really hard on ourselves to say, is this a story that has actual tension in it, or am I trying to create tension around a list of things I want you to take away from my presentation?
Got it. Thanks, Joan. This next question is specifically for Sean. Sean, what was your strategy going into that tough meeting with the skydiving company where you had to tell them to change up their language?
Well, it's always easier to present hard to hear information when it's supported by data and or bringing the consumers into the room. And so we had constructed several actual quantitative surveys that actually showed how limiting the language was from a perceptual sort of standpoint. And it was compelling. We were able to actually show them that they would be able to increase their overall base and repeat use of their products by X% if they were to expand their language, maybe not change the signage on the building, but expand their language to include terms like body flight and or flying, and to step away from the language where they drew quite literal equations between how much a minute of the time cost. Because if you sell the total experience versus the 2 minutes, you're going to get a much richer value proposition. So that was a case where, coming in with some data that we were actually able to model out to a percentage of a consumer base that would be interested in their product, or a direct link to sales increase, easier to have that conversation.
Thanks, Sean. This next one is geared more towards Sean and Walt. Do you discuss or negotiate your report format or style up front with clients? Walt, let's start with you on that.
Yeah, and I assume they're talking about a research report. I think it depends. It depends on what the ultimate outcome is that they're seeking, that you're seeking together. We have a process and we have formats that we can use, but we're always very open to working with what is going to help the client and the organization understand and take away what's most important. Joan said this earlier, that the presentation is only really the beginning of the story. It is not just about what you say in the room. It's about leaving something behind that they can socialize and that people can kind of take and own in their own way. So I think it's a big mistake to not talk about what the ultimate format is going to be, but we've seen it both sides, where clients sometimes are very specific about how they want it to end up, and other times they're more open to having us share our perspective on that.
I completely agree with Walt, and I recognize a couple of examples with a client that we did negotiate up front what that format would look like, and then taking it a step further, what the end use was going to be. And this client actually shared that they needed, an encapsulation video that couldn't be over, say, 2 minutes for the shareholders meeting, that needed to be able to bring them along on that journey, sell into research and the insights, so that once they presented the creative platform, everyone in the room was nodding. So we actually, wrote the research plan and developed the format that would allow us the flexibility to get to those really salient insights to drop into a 2-minute video at the end. So we almost reverse engineered it, because we knew it had to come down to 2 minutes of storytelling. And that was a very helpful piece of information going in, number one, and then also a new way of looking at how you're going to package and sell those hopefully evergreen insights once you're finished.
Got it, thank you. Next question we have, how have deliverables changed in the last 10 years, or how should they change to adapt and meet the needs of giving clients something engaging, robust, and useful without overwhelming them? I think, Joan, you might be able to, you touched on this a little bit earlier.
Of course, the ideal is when you have a little bit of time to take people through an experience. And I don't think it has to be a big event like sending them out shopping, et cetera. I think it can be an experience where they answer a question one way at the beginning of an engagement, of a conversation, and then they have to answer it differently when they realize that their own lives are a little bit different. For instance, I used to ask people if they were loyal to any products. And P&G people think, every corporate person I've ever spoken to from any company thinks that consumers are loyal to their products because they encounter people in focus groups who say they're loyal to their products. So I would ask the executives, are you loyal to any products? And they would say yes. And I'd say not P&G products, because you only buy those because it contributes to your profit sharing. And they'd say, yes, for instance, I only drink Diet Coke. And I would say, okay, what are all the soft drinks you've bought in the last month? And they would have to stop and think, well, we had a party, so I bought a bunch of other things. And my son doesn't drink Diet Coke. He only drinks Mountain Dew. And I would force them through this conversation about, are you loyal? Would you look loyal in household panel data? Do you really think that's what loyalty is? Just because every morning you have a Diet Coke, don't you drink iced tea with lunch, et cetera? So it can be a 5-minute exercise just to push their thinking a little bit. And I would encourage you to do that, and to give your business partners tips on how to do that. They're the people who have to carry your work forward, as Walt was saying and Sean was saying, being really clear on helping them create those little aha moments for their stakeholders makes a huge difference as well.
Thanks, Joan. This next one looks like it's geared a little bit towards you as well. When you requested clients to partake in the pre-research exercise, such as the P&G example, have you ever experienced pushback? If so, why, and how did you manage that?
Yes, and I think the key to managing that is something that I believe Sean said earlier, which is keeping it so simple it's hard to argue with. So we would get whys and we'd say, it's 5 minutes, just go ahead and do it. And when you can get it down to something like that, people usually will do it just because you asked them to, not because, you know, it's not asking a whole lot. The other thing that I think we all probably need to consider more, and I don't have great answers on this, is how people consume media and activities is changing a lot over the last 5 or 6 years. And if anybody looks at how any of us read the news, you know, headlines have changed a lot in the last years. How do we take the natural human tendency to move toward things that pose surprises, for instance, like the obnoxious headlines that we all click on and say, you'll be amazed when you find out what XYZ did. How do we start to use that for good in a research process or a sharing process or a pre-work process that pulls people in and invites them in a way that they want to do it instead of telling them you have to do it?
Thanks, Joan. Sean or Walt, have you ever experienced anything like that? Pushback and how you overcame that?
Yeah, I think certainly there are some people who just don't want to play. But I think Joan's point is really smart. Is that, you know, and it kind of goes to the previous question of how should we evolve deliverables? Well, we should evolve deliverables as appropriate for the situation, and that same perspective applies to how you would enroll people the recipients or the audience in a research project or the dissemination of that research. You know, you don't have to apply the same approach to every single person. If you can get the same result through a different method, then do that. Especially if that person is a key influencer or stakeholder. Don't make them play the same game, but play the game that is going to allow them to really get invested and enrolled in whatever you're going to do.
Thanks, Walt. Next question. Small research teams or companies wear many hats. How can researchers who might be primarily data technicians, operation managers, and project managers become storytellers given limited time and money? Who can answer that one?
Well, this is Sean. There's not a silver bullet answer, number one. I think that taking in as much content as you can, relevant to what you're trying to achieve, you know, beg, borrow, steal, look at what other people do that really was compelling for you, and certainly craft something that's uniquely your own, but you don't have to start from complete, you know, building it from the ground up. I think everybody has their own unique style, and some people don't have that muscle of storytelling and really need to only provide data, and that's okay too. I think being collaborative, you know, amongst that small team and finding out really who has that natural ability to create sort of the logic flow or an interesting sort of provocative question around what you're trying to build may be one way to approach building out a team that can handle that. But I would look around at a lot of other content and see what is really compelling for you. And again, this is actually related to the deliverables question in terms of what your team is trying to produce or replicate on a regular basis. There's no shame in developing somewhat of a format that works for you that you can go back to and mine again and again. Now, I caution, because you don't want your work to be formulaic, but you certainly can have somewhat of a format that's flexible that you can build from. That always helps too.
Hey, this is Joan, and I think Sean's answer is terrific and great practical advice. The only thing I would add is I've spent a lot of my career evolving people's skills, because at Procter & Gamble, people aim for long careers, and they're always learning the new ways of doing things in order to stay competitive and relevant. And I would argue that in addition to all the good things John said, to show people what it looks like and encourage them to try. Researchers sometimes, not always, but sometimes go into research because they think it might be a one-step removed activity system that doesn't require you to put yourself on the line in a vulnerable way. And it's not, and it is importantly becoming less and less that every day. And Walt said earlier, you need to put yourself into it. Most people can, maybe not everybody's going to be great at it, but most people can get better at it, and will, with the push to take their own risks and with some examples of this is what it looks like, just go try, will get better. And if everybody gets better, the whole industry will get better. So I would just strongly recommend that people just try.
And let me just add on and say, I think the fact that we are human beings means that we're all good storytellers in some way. And I totally agree, is that we need to kind of find that that within us, because it's how we've been learning and passing along information for a long time. So it's embedded in us. It's in our DNA. We just have to find it.
Thanks, Walt. Okay, we know it's right at 1 o'clock. We have one more question. We feel that final PowerPoint reports are contributing to the demise of written communication professionally, to now just becoming picture books for adults. Do you feel this way too? Do you think there will be final elimination of the written report to convey research results? How do you feel about that, Sean?
Well, there's always a role for the written word. PowerPoint may not be the solution in the long term, but I would hope that we won't completely, turn away from the written word. I personally love data formats and have built several that allow for some statistical fun within video telling format. So, when you can merge the two things together, a lot of sight, sound, and motion, but also punch it up with some real data as well, I think you can land in a very interesting space in terms of telling your story. I don't know that the written word really needs to be as pedantic as it is sometimes. And, the example that Joan gave of the 1,000-page report that she said, I will never read this, we need to know our limits, and we need to know our clients' limits in terms of absorbing that information and getting to what's useful out of it. So I think we also need to be filters of that when we are approaching a written report.
Thanks, Sean. All right, those were excellent questions, and thanks, Sean, Joan, and Walt for answering those. As mentioned previously, we'll be emailing out the recording of this webinar, and you can view this webinar as well as learn about our technology tools offered through L&E Solutions at www.lneresearch.com. Thanks for joining us today, and be on the lookout in your email for an invite for our next webinar we're hosting in our series. Have a great afternoon.